Good afternoon. My name is Brett Blacker and I'm the CEO of English Australia. It's my pleasure to be here with you and to present this webinar on our Innovation Development Fund 2021. Today, we will try to give you as much information about the new Innovation Development Funds and support colleges that are looking to apply for the fund with critical information to help you across the application process. First of all, I'd like to provide some information about the fund and just some background to how it became in existence. Secondly, we'll overview some of the key dates for which you need to be aware of, particularly if you're applying for one of the grants. We'll then look at the eligibility and provide some responses to frequently asked questions which we've already received regarding some of those eligibility requirements. We'll overview the selection criteria, which colleges need to submit in addition to eligibility, and then some general information related to the program itself and the application portal. I encourage you to use our Q&A function throughout today's presentation. We have both chat and Q&A available, but we'd prefer if you could keep all of the questions in Q&A, and then at the end of the program, presentation, I will aim to address those questions that have been also put into the Q&A throughout the presentation, particularly if they're not answered as we do the FAQs along the way. First of all, I'd really encourage you to access the program guidelines if you haven't had the opportunity to do so. Today, we will be providing considerable amount of information which has been published in those guidelines. However, it's also good to have those readily available, and if you've got them accessible, you'll be able to correlate with any of the particular sessions, mark up, make your own notes, and just post that relevant to what information is covered today as well. The link to where you can find the guidelines is available. If you're having any trouble, please visit the English Australia website. On the front banner of the English Australia website, we have information, a banner which you can link through, and it will also provide a direct link for you to access the guidelines. So as we're getting started and set up, I'd encourage you to access those guidelines either through our website or via the Department of Education Skills and Employment's page. Just like to note that today's presentation is being recorded, and we will have a copy of this presentation available after the session. So if there's something you want to come back and review, the material will also be available at that stage. First of all, it's with, I guess, a strong amount of thanks from English Australia for the foundations of this grant program. It was announced back on the 26th of November 2021 by the Honourable Minister Tudge, Minister for Education. And this program was part of a package of actions that the Minister has released to support the international education sector as we progress through the COVID-19 pandemic. It was released equally as part of the Australian Strategy for International Education, and recognising the ELICOS sector as a really critical component of that, the entire landscape. And this package is above and beyond some of the regulatory support and fee waivers, which are accessible to all CRICOS providers with an extended period for English language providers as well. So I do really want to just take this opportunity to thank Minister Tudge and the Department of Education, Skills and Employment for providing the funds for this grants program, which comes on top of the initial $9 million that was provided as part of the initial funds back in April last year for the Innovation Fund. So we now have two completely new, completely different programs, mutually exclusive, albeit in many ways aligned, supporting the ELICOS sector with a package over $18 million provided for our private ELICOS sector specifically. One of the primary differences between the Innovation Fund, the first tranche of the program, and the Innovation Development Fund is that the first program had eligibility for private ELICOS and private higher education, whereas the second fund is specifically targeting the private ELICOS sector. We all know how hard hit the sector has been and the severity of the declines over the past period since the international borders have been closed. But it's really welcomed support, and I know it's been a lifeline for many colleges that have looked to innovate over the life of the first program as well. So the main objective, and it's really critical that colleges are aware of the objective of the program, it's to ensure that there is support for providers to innovate and diversify their education offering. And those two themes remain consistent around online delivery and that diversification in offshore programs and the delivery and way in which we can work with our partners offshore. Now, noting the guidelines have been developed and released by Department of Education, Skills and Employment, and they guide the role that English Australia will play in administering the program. So we are very proud here at English Australia to have been offered the opportunity to be the program administrator for the International Development Fund 21-22. This program, on top of the innovation program, we certainly advocated strongly for and worked really closely in terms of the way in which we tried to identify opportunity for sector stimulus and sector support. But again, in a very, very busy landscape with a lot of providers needing support, not just in the education sector, but across many sectors. We're delighted to be able to have the cut through and the support from the Commonwealth Government for this program. Our role for English Australia is to ensure that you're all aware of the program, and certainly we're doing our best to communicate this program to you. Equally, in administering the program, we will be managing the application process. We house and will support the application portal. We will do the assessment of your applications and the approval process. Post that point, and for those that have had experience with the Innovation Fund, you'll also know that we will then distribute grant agreements to successful grantees. And upon execution, we will then manage the fund's distribution. Right now, for the previous fund, the Innovation Fund, we're also undertaking the acquittal and reconciliation, and we will do a similar process for this new fund in terms of ensuring that the funds that are made accessible are utilised for the appropriate purpose, and that there is a very clear acquittal and reconciliation of the grant money towards the activities that those that are successful undertake during the program. If necessary, we will undertake the roll around recovery of funds. We have had instances where providers have gone into hibernation during this period, and we've had to seek a refund of unspent money. And similarly, if projects don't utilise allocated funds, then it's our role to ensure that those funds are recovered and returned to the Commonwealth. Throughout this program and the Innovation Fund as well, we'll be looking to evaluate the success of the program. We're always looking to capture the stories from providers on how you've utilised the grant funding, but equally ensuring the way in which we operate with you is done to the most appropriate manner. So today's in the presentation, as mentioned, we're going to cover quite a lot what's in the guidelines and do FAQs, but again, encourage you if there's things you'd like to know specifically to capture those in the Q&A. So the Department of Education, Skills and Employment is ultimately responsible for the compliance checks, and obviously within the process that we undertake, we are looking to validate information that providers submit as part of the application process. We may come back to you as part of the process and seek clarification to ensure the documentation supports the criteria. After we undertake that process, then there is another layer for which the Department of Education, Skills and Employment have access to critical information to ensure that there is validation of some of the information where required as well. So we will certainly undertake all of the day-to-day functions. And if you have any questions or require any support, please don't hesitate to reach out to English Australia, and we'll provide those contact details for you. But we're certainly here to help you throughout this process of applying for the grant, and of course, for those that are successful through the next year of the program administration. The pool of funds that was made available was $9 million, and that's the total available funds under this grant, the Innovation Development Fund 2021. Providers are able to apply for up to $150,000 in their grant allocation. Now, again, looking at the criteria and the objectives, just stipulating that way in which we're seeking colleges to be able to diversify your education offering, and really looking into that online and offshore is at the heart of the program objectives. More information is available in section 1 of the grant guidelines, and encourage you to take the opportunity. You may apply for less if you seek to do a project that isn't of value to $150,000, and equally you may contribute more than that money allocated towards program, and there's been a number of examples that we are aware of where providers have utilised their own funds to support the program on top of the grant. Now, just sort of a whole spectrum of ways in which we see that providers can utilise the money that they're provided, the funds that they're provided under the grant. If the program's oversubscribed, our role as program administrator will be to reduce the allocated amounts, and it's done in an equitable manner, in which we will look at a reduction based on the level of declines experienced between the 2019-2021 calendar years. And coming back to that, we want to know that on this program, it's also one of the unique factors, well, sorry, it's not unique, it's consistent with the last program, but your grant allocation can only be to the value of the loss that you've experienced. So I think there's an example provided, but if you have experienced a decline in that period between 2020 and 2021, covering this grant period, if your decline was $94,000, then the amount of eligible grant funding is only up to that $94,000. So if a provider, for example, has only experienced a decline of $10,000, you're not eligible for a $150,000 grant. You'll be granted up to the amount of your loss during that period. And so some of these points that we're noting relate to information that we will then gather as part of the application process to allow us to make the assessment. So the grant period for this money, and this money has been allocated out of the 2021-2022 federal budget. And so that financial year is the grant period. The opening dates, as you'd be aware, commenced on the 4th of January, and applications can be submitted now. The portal is live, and indeed a number of providers have already commenced their application and have those applications in progress. A key and critical date is the 28th of January 2022, at which by midnight we will close the application system, and therefore you won't be able to lodge an application post that date. So it's really important, if you do intend to apply, you have it updated and completed before midnight on the 28th of January. Now, the grant period is for 1 year, and all of the activity and reconciliation will happen within that year period. And I'll provide some more detail around that as we work through today's webinar. So what you need to do is essentially ensure that you can provide the appropriate evidence to support the eligibility criteria, which we will then use to undertake our assessment. That information is then validated and compliance checks undertaken. Ticking off all those boxes, then we look forward to working with the successful grantees. I've outlined the first two key dates around the application process being open and close. Just noting that we will, as English Australia, aim to do our assessment of all of your applications in around sort of that week post the 28th. And our determination will be to then provide advice back to grantees from the 7th of January. So if it's not on the 7th, it'll be around the 7th of January. And we'll then start communicating with successful and unsuccessful grantees, but working through the agreement process with those that are provided the opportunity to take one of the grants. Now, the last two dates are critical, so it's all completed by the 31st of December, albeit similar for those that have been undertaking the Innovation Fund. We have a mid-program point reconciliation and acquittal, which will be the 30th of June. At the 30th of June for the International Development Fund, you will need to acquit all of the funds spent up until that day, and then what's been committed, and provide evidences of commitment for the second half of the program up towards the 31st of December. Moving on now, just looking at our eligibility criteria, and again, all stipulated and outlined in the guidelines. And this set of criteria is then mirrored, which you'll see a bit later, in the application portal. So essentially being CRICOS registered and as a private provider who primarily delivers ALICOS. And to verify that, you need to be privately owned through your ASIC documentation. Very importantly, in terms of the impact of the border closure, the international border closure, showing that there's been a 50% decline in revenue from international students in the 2019 calendar year. Now, I just preface that in that calendar year, it's again a similar process to what was undertaken applying for the Innovation Fund. And I'll outline in a moment just how we will seek to have your financial documentations for that calendar year submitted to us. Now, in the second part of the criteria, it's that you've experienced the decline of 30% or more in your international student revenue. And just as a reminder, international student revenue is the revenue reported to the Tuition Protection Service, so the TPS revenue. And for this program, it's the decline experienced over that period from 2019 to 2021. Now, we recognise that the 2021 TPS declarations haven't been completed. And what we will consider is if you can validate the information via your enrolment data. That can also be a satisfactory way to show the level of decline, meaning the 30% threshold in 2021. Now, what we would suggest is to essentially follow the same process that you'll be undertaking for your TPS submission. It's separate, and I just want to ensure people are aware that this process is not in lieu of your TPS declarations and does not substitute TPS declarations. We're just proposing or recommending you follow a similar methodology to ensure that your data is valid. And then lastly, it's around ensuring not a Table A, B or C provider, as outlined in the Higher Education Act 2003, or a subsidiary of one of those providers. And again, very similar criteria to what was utilised in the first program. So for providers that may have been applied in the first program as a subsidiary and were ineligible, unfortunately the same criteria will apply, and essentially the eligibility criteria will remain that you need to, your institution is not listed as a Table A, B or C provider, not sharing the same CRICOS code, or essentially controlled under a controlled entity status around that. So this requirement is exactly the same as the previous grant in that. So is there a preferred validation method? Just looking at some of those eligibility criteria that we've just covered off. So the preferred method for the validation of the 50% will be your audited financial statements. And again, looking back at that 2019 year, the year that it's most important in this instance. Now, if for some reason you don't have audited financial statements available, then you can utilise a statutory declaration process. But for those that applied and the evidence provided was acceptable for demonstrating the 2019 program, similar criteria here, so a similar evidence base will be acceptable. Albeit you still will be required, if you're applying for this grant, to upload that information into the program. Now, I guess if there is anything in terms of those guidelines that the 50% that you need to question, we will note that there will be an ability for you to seek that, send us an inquiry, and we can have that validated. And when we look at the 50% ruling, which you'll need to indicate in the application process, I just preface that under the compliance check, we'll need to ensure that the more than 50% of your business, more than 50% of your business was in ELICOS, and we can validate that through the data that's accessible, or Department of Education can validate that as well. Now, should the international student revenue decline, so how should that decline by 30% or more between 2019 and 2021? So we're capturing this against 21, and I know there's been some questions come up in the Q&A. This is impact between 2019 and 2021. And the method that we are utilising, it's the TPS records from 2019, the TPS declaration. For 2021, as I mentioned, you won't have your TPS declaration, so that you could look to validate this through providing evidence of your enrolment program, and using the same method and the same formula for what you would do in submitting your TPS declaration is what we would advise. For those that need advice or want more information, there is a link at the bottom of this screen where you can go to look at the methodology for calculating your enrolments as per TPS. I'm sure many of you are well and truly aware of those points, but I think the most important thing is that you make sure that in validating that decline between 19 and 21, your 2021 data is correct. If for some reason that is not correct and you do apply for the funds and manage to be awarded the funds, and at the time of your TPS declaration being undertaken, the grant would be ineligible and you would be required to refund all of the money if you do not follow the correct process. So the really important criteria there is to make sure you're following a similar methodology. There may be variations, we accept that as you go through your final TPS declaration, but you'll still need to be validated as at the 30% mark. So what is the determination of being CRICOS registered private ELICOS? So as this program is defined specifically for private providers, we've asked you to ensure that you have the ASIC documentation as part of your application, one of the criteria to validate the private component. Now, should your business in ELICOS delivery be more than 50%? So how do we determine that component? So this question, and I know it's come up in Q&A as well, it's around with your data, so if you look at the revenue that you earned in 2019 as part of your TPS declaration, you need to be able to ensure that the over 50% of that revenue was earned through ELICOS student enrolments. Now, as I mentioned, this is the part of the program whereby compliance checks can be undertaken. From experience in the previous program, I know there was providers that applied, which were dual, vocational education and ELICOS providers. But on reflecting and on review of the data set, the more than 50% of their business in 2019 was actually through the vocational arm of their business. And therefore, it was not deemed as eligible. So the criteria is to make sure that this is really targeting providers that were predominantly teaching ELICOS students in that 2019 period. Another one of the criteria was around CRICOS codes, and should they have changed. Now, if you've changed your CRICOS code throughout any of this period, I should note, you will not be eligible to apply. So you've had to have had a CRICOS registered entity that was established in 2000 or before the closure of the borders, that is still an ongoing entity today. So it's just another one of the stipulations to ensure that this program is of benefit to those that were operating pre the international border closures and have experienced the decline during that time. Okay, for the criteria around the financial basis, so what we're asking is that in these program submissions, you consider the financial year, and we understand financial reporting, and many of those processes are undertaken on the financial year. For the purpose of this program and aligning to sort of our TPS reporting requirements, your TPS reporting requirements, we are looking for the financial statements which are valid for calendar years. Again, you know, we've worked through this process as part of the previous innovation fund, and you know, of the 63 providers that were awarded the grants were able to meet this criteria. We're happy to provide advice on ensuring that the documentation you provide is appropriate. Now, we wish to seek an exemption from the eligibility criteria. So what I would say is throughout this process and certainly up till the application close time, please come and seek clarity around any of the criteria. By all means, test scenarios with us. We're more than happy to try and work through any of those questions you may have. Equally, we can seek support and clarity through our relationship with the department where required, but there aren't any exemptions to the eligibility criteria. So if you fail to meet those criteria, then you will not be deemed eligible for the program. And I just want to stipulate, so there's all opportunity for discussion and clarity, and we're happy to work with you to support you through this process, but you'll need to ensure that the criteria are all met. Moving back to the eligibility criteria here, it's the you need to be, I guess, aware and as part of your application's conditions, you will have to agree via checkbox and through your declarations that sharing with the program administrator, you're sharing your information with us, and in that context, that will be shared with the department where appropriate. And as I mentioned earlier, you need to agree that the 2021 TPS records will be validated once they are available, and funds will be recovered if you have not met any of the criteria. So you need to ensure that that criteria is met. Now, I know there's been some questions around the 2021, so we just want to ensure that when we look at the financial loss of the provider, should you have declined less than 150,000 as per the anticipated revenue decline from 2019 to 2021, that's what will be also validated by the TPS records. So it's really critical that in your application, in your assessment for your grant allocation, you're not applying for more than what the anticipated decline will be between 2020 and 2021, because if there is a variance, that's when the funds will need to be recovered and returned as part of the program guidelines. Any questions? We're happy to answer that at any stage post today's webinar. Now, one thing that has been stipulated, there is no opportunity as part of this sort of grants process now to go back and amend your report, so your 2020 report. And if there is any amendments that are made through your processes, it will have no bearing on the assessment for this grants program. So what's now set as part of your TPS requirements, your TPS reporting requirements, regulatory reporting requirements, will be the benchmarks that will be used for the assessment of this program. These are just a couple of footnotes that, again, are listed in the guidelines, but we're just highlighting them because from experience, we know that there was questions raised around the reference to international student revenue and whether that included ancillary revenue from other programs, non-student visa revenue, for example, and it's been clarified and it's very explicit to refer to the international student tuition revenue for which a provider reports as part of their TPS process, which is what we will be looking to undertake the benchmark assessment in terms of economic decline. And that, again, we just stressing that this will be verified. So we are working with information which we're taking from providers as true and correct, but we'll also need to ensure, and the Commonwealth will be ensuring, that there are validation processes in here. Okay, I think thank you to Dirk. I know we've got a shout out to Dirk Mulder in the background, who's our project officer, and many of those who have worked with the Innovation Fund would have already had contact and been working with Dirk throughout that program. So if you're putting things in the Q&A at the moment, many of those are getting answered by Dirk as well as we go along. Compliance. So one thing that we do want to note is that there will be these compliance checks undertaken, and that as part of the application process, that due diligence process, once the applications are assessed, will be compliance checks back through, where appropriate, through the regulatory body, and looking to determine and make sure that information around your accreditation, financial viability, compliance has all been upheld. And so, again, just by submitting the application, you are essentially validating that you are aware that that your application will be assessed by these entities and agree to the outcome from the assessment basis. Just reinforcing, the eligibility is for CRICOS registered providers that were in operation prior to the border closure. So that's taking us back now to providers that were operating before the 19th of May 2020 will be the period. And so you must have had that business operating before that period. Now, if during this period, and again, I referenced that we know that it's been a difficult period, and we've worked with providers that have gone through hibernation or gone into hibernation during the previous program or the current running program. If for any reason your college has been inactive or in hibernation during any point in that 2020 period, then the UR 2020-2021, you're not eligible to apply for funding under this grant opportunity. So again, it's for providers that have continued to operate during that period. So I know that there has been some questions around hibernation and the what is considered hibernating or ceased operating. So in the program guidelines, and again, referring to specifically in the definitions of page 17, there's a reference to what hibernation will be considered or how hibernation will be considered. I just want to note that we will be guided equally by the regulatory position, and obviously we are working on the basis that providers have met all of their regulatory requirements during this period of the pandemic, and I know the sector has worked really hard to do so. So we'll be ensuring or wanting to ensure that our definition of hibernation is that it could be a registration on hold, that's been defined under ASQA's guidelines, and we've listed some more information. So obviously, again, we're working on the basis that providers have met their obligations for reporting around any substantial or significant change event over that period. And the validation process, as I mentioned, will be also interactions with the regulatory bodies and TPS. Okay. You are not eligible for the grant. So just quickly, obviously, if in the grant guidelines, any of those eligibility criteria that we've been through, you do not meet, the selection criteria, which I'll cover off in a second, if you're unable to meet the selection criteria or haven't adequately addressed the selection criteria, do not meet the length of operation requirements, and that's why I've reinforced those points. Now, if you're receiving Commonwealth funds for a project or a program of work that you want to undertake under the program, that's ineligible. However, the exemption is if you've received the Innovation Fund, then you are certainly eligible to apply. Again, reinforcing these are two distinct programs. We will, in the selection criteria, have some specific questions for those that have participated in the Innovation Fund, but it means that providers could apply for one, both, or either of the programs. So they're certainly mutually exclusive in that respect. You're not facing any sanctions, not a consortium, so you're not able to apply for the grant as a consortium of providers, and you haven't closed or hibernated as referenced in the past slide as well. So just quickly, and again, we had a few questions in the previous grant program around a consortium. So essentially, a consortium is defined as if there's a formal arrangement between two or more eligible tertiary providers. Now, if in any of these instances we have applications from consortium, we can only accept the application for one. So these are designed for a specific CRICOS institution, not a consortium of institutions to apply for the grant under that basis. So just wanted to again stipulate those criteria. Now, coming back, so we've had a look at eligibility so far, and the second requirement will be for you to respond to selection criteria. Now, so in addition to meeting eligibility in 3.1, the selection criteria. So the first is around your ability to diversify business models and wanting to make sure that you're able to demonstrate, I guess, a plan on how you're going to diversify your business and establish and expand in your online and offshore offerings by receiving this grant. Now, there's a reference to how strong applicants will be able to leverage their information and leverage investments made in infrastructure, staffing expertise, marketing and promotion, the development and design of curriculum, which has certainly been something we've seen in the previous program, and innovation in that digital teaching solutions. So, essentially we're hoping that these funds are, we require that the funds are used to ensure that our Australian early cost sector is able to open new markets through the use of this program, that we're innovative and leading in many ways into, I guess, a post-COVID environment whereby these innovation practices and the investment can continue to provide a return to the Australian economy and all of the providers involved. Now, I did note that if you've received the previous fund, you must provide examples of how the initial grant funding has supported your business and demonstrate how this funding will support you to innovate further. So there'll be a specific requirement for any current grant recipient to respond to that question around examples of how they've used the fund and demonstration of how this will essentially further innovate existing or new projects that they determine are appropriate. Now, ability to adapt in the current environment, again, so you have to address this selection criteria and looking at the efforts that your businesses have made during this period to adapt, and looking at where particularly online and international students offshore, how you've supported that transition across this period. We want to know how it's going to benefit your business and a strong case to that long-term viability, which I've just mentioned a moment ago, and beyond the completion of this program. So we don't want you just to look at this as a 12-month window. It's got to be about leveraging these funds and developing a platform for further opportunities, further pipelines of students to support international education in Australia through online and offshore development. And lastly, the business plan. And just want to stress with the business plan, this is more around sort of those key activities and investments that you are aiming to make through the program. And so, you're ultimately going to have to just articulate by accessing this grant, you are aiming to undertake these certain activities, which will be costed at certain amounts, and then, as validated up front, will provide the returns that you've outlined you're seeking to achieve by the benefits. So how much detail is required? Now, we don't necessarily need each one of these questions to be overly onerous. Now, generally, we've seen that providers can answer it in around a 500-word response. You will have the ability to upload documents if required, but again, our suggestion is to try and keep it concise, be very clear on what you're aiming to achieve, the objectives for those selection criteria, as I've just outlined, and concisely answer what you're aiming to do with the grants to achieve the objectives of the program via each one of those elements. And with the business plan, again, I guess we're kind of say it's almost that plan on a page type philosophy, outlining the budget activities you plan to undertake and your anticipated outcomes from those activities. Okay, so we've looked at the about, we've looked at the key dates, we've looked at the eligibility and selection criteria, as well as the ineligibility as part of the process. Just want to quickly provide an overview of the application process. If you've already undertaken innovation funds, then you would be familiar with this platform that English Australia uses. If not, we'll give a very quick demonstration. So essentially, located on the English Australia website, you'll be able to go through to the application platform, and we have a link displaying for you now. If you're new to the platform, please set it up in terms of your registration. If you've been in the previous program, you're able to utilize your login details and log in using the your similar email password to be able to access the information. I know this is small. It's more for demonstration purposes than necessarily the detail. But essentially, when you enter the program, you'll come into the Innovation Development Fund portal, And again, what you will see is a little bit of information around the process itself. Again, we'll reinforce the key dates that you need to be mindful of, noting if you need any support to contact us, and then you will start your application. If you are a returning provider, then again, you'll still go through these similar steps. But once you're here, you need to then start completing information around provider name, ensuring the provider name matches the name of the CRICOS registered entity who is applying for the program, and then acknowledging that the information that you're submitting will be validated and audited. Throughout the process, we've got little hints and tips with question mark icons. If you need any advice, then first of all, check out the information which gives some guidance, or jump on, send us an email, but it's quite self-explanatory once you start the process. And if you've got those guidelines handy, if you've followed the steps and worked through how you'll be responding to those in advance, the information will all flow relatively easily. But here, again, the CRICOS provider number aligned with the provider name, which you've put in, all of those details that were required. And then you start to put in the detail around the volume, of funds that you wish to apply for, up to the $150,000. Noting that is $150,000 is ex-GST. If we go through the process and you're successful, providers can nominate to receive the GST, which is on top of that grant payment. But the additional funds for GST is explicitly for the payment of GST. So if you do not utilise that throughout your expenditure, you'll then need to refund any of the additional funds over and above which are provided specifically for the GST component. And again, just reinforcing that it's in line with the economic loss. I've mentioned this already, I won't go over it, just making sure you followed the outline of the questions which are followed the outline of criteria in eligibility document, and hopefully information provided today just to provide some clarity. And you will need to validate as part of your own declaration that the information is true and correct. And that's essentially your legally binding declaration at that point. Within the selection criteria, again, we've covered eligibility. Here is where you will put in your ability to adapt your business model and those other things down to the business planning process, which I've just mentioned. And again, check boxes are all there available, text boxes, and as well, if you need to upload information, the option is there. I've noted if you have an account already, just sign in and follow the process, so you won't have to go through all of it. If you haven't, please register a new account. And also, if you've got multiple people from the same institutions, just mindful we can only accept one application from that provider. So please ensure that you coordinate within your institution who is lodging the application on behalf of that CRICOS entity. We'll seek validation if required, but it's much more streamlined if you can get that all arranged in front. Now, now, use of funds. I guess when we look at the use of funds, again, the criteria is quite broad. I've mentioned some of the options previously, curriculum development, staff expertise, those type of things that we've mentioned, infrastructure, but there is a certain amount of information which isn't available via you aren't able to use the grant funds for. So things such as your ordinary operating costs, rent, electricity, utility bills, purchase of land, those things outlined here. And again, costs with staffing, if it's just regular ongoing staffing costs, that cannot be covered through the program. If it's costs related to personnel and staffing working specifically for and on behalf of or part of the project, then those are eligible, claimable items. And any retrospective costs. So if you have costs incurred in this application process, none of that is claimable throughout the grant, and we need to stipulate that you can't charge back funds for any retrospective work until the grant is awarded to you, and it's at the execution date post that whereby you can then incur funds to use for the grants program. And similarly, as I've mentioned, unless it's the innovation fund, you can't be already receiving funds for the program. I think I've just referenced this because we have had inquiries around costs associated with doing grant applications, and those costs are not eligible grant program costs. So it's designed for how you as a provider can utilise the funds post receiving the funds to diversify your business and develop and grow online and offshore business capability. One thing to note that in the program, so I've kind of mentioned that the program will be run over this year. So it's in the 21-22 Commonwealth budget. The program itself will have a lifespan of the 2022 calendar year. Similar again to Innovation Fund, but for those that are not involved, what we will require is essentially at the halfway mark, around the 30th of June, you'll need to do a reconciliation and acquittal of funds spent up to that point, and then be able to identify a commitment moving forward. And I'll give a little bit more of evidence of that in a moment. Now, yeah, I guess it's making sure that you need to demonstrate the funds aren't used for any of that ineligible activity, and the department and through our services reserve the right to recoup any funds that have been used for ineligible expense. Any unused funds needs to be returned to the Commonwealth as well, and we will work with providers around that process and recover funds if required, either through non-use, inappropriate use, or if a provider needs to go into hibernation during that time. So we essentially have a really critical role to play in the application assessment and to ensure that all due diligence is processed, is undertaken throughout the process in accordance with the grant guidelines. If it's oversubscribed, I've provided detail already today on how a measure will be used based on economic loss to determine the amount a provider will receive. And essentially, we'll go through all of these steps. You can seek information from us, and if necessary, we can then ensure that that information, or if you need to, can go to the Commonwealth. But once the decision is made, that decision is final. Please seek any support, and certainly we hope to, that's on a very amicable basis. If you've got any questions, we aim to address them with you. If there's any disputes, we'll work through that with you. If it's unlikely, in the unlikely event that it can be resolved, then it can be referred to the department. You will need to enter into the legal binding agreement, and you, again, throughout the application process, are validating the information you provided is true and correct through your declarations. Once those agreements are distributed, we in Australia will execute those with you and arrange for the invoicing and processes to be undertaken for you to receive the funds and start the processes. But any expenditure, again, that you may have related to the projects isn't able to be claimed until you have the program executed, and it's any expenses incurred at your own risk up until that point. Okay, so we'll have the opportunity to do our assessment, as I mentioned up front, in about a week or so after you apply, and you'll then have 10 days to review the grant agreement sign and return to us, at which point then once it's successful, we will work with you through till the remainder of this year on the grant administration, for which there will be reporting timelines on grants progress and acquittal processes to be undertaken. And again, if there is any breach of the agreements, then the funds will be recovered. Very quickly, again, I think I've covered most of these items off. It's essentially ensuring that the payments are only made once the grants are executed, cannot exceed the maximum amount that has been stipulated. We will take into account those reductions. So again, very critical that you look at your evidence base for your TPS documentation. And if necessary, we encourage you to speak to your tax advisors around any impact that receiving a grant may provide to you. Now, you'll need to submit reports throughout, and we can work again with each of our providers, and we have multiple information sources and packages come to you around meeting your reporting and acquittal timeframes. Now, again, I think I've mentioned this, but essentially by June 30 this year, all grantees will need to acquit the first half of the program. So any funds spent up to the 30th of June, and then outline your commitments and contracts in place for funds to be spent between 1 July and 31st of December. Happy to work with providers around any clarity that's needed there. Now, I've seen that so far we've had questions go through Q&A, quite a number of them, 25 different questions come through so far, which we've answered throughout the process. And again, thanks to Dirk for responding to those. We have just a couple of minutes left now. So if there's any questions that you may have which have not been tabled so far, encourage you to raise them if you would like to now put them into the Q&A. Happy to hold on and see if anything comes through. Alternatively, we will we'll respond to any inquiries that you may have. Please email us after the webinar. The email on the screen, so innovation@englishaustralia.com.au. A recording of this webinar will be made available, and that'll be hosted on the English Australia website. And we can certainly follow up with any questions that you may have after today. So it's a really exciting program. Once again, thanks to Department of Education, Skills and Employment. And I do need to acknowledge the support for Minister Tudge, who took on board all of the advocacy that was presented and recognised the needs of the sector specifically through this program. Which really is making and will make a significant difference. So no questions are coming through in the Q&A. It's now at the close of the webinar time. So we will leave the presentation there. Please do contact us for any further information. And we look forward to working with many of you throughout the grants process. Thanks very much, and bye for now.